You're listening to WWHI Muncie, Indiana, WCRD 91.3 FM, always better radio.
Now, your weather forecast from the forecasters at 91.3 WCRD.
Hello, I'm weather forecaster Liz Safchak. Today we've seen those sunny, clear skies with a high of 52, and that's due to a high pressure system that's currently to the west of our region, pushing those clouds out toward the east. Tonight we're going to be continuing to see that clear skies that we've been seeing today, and we're going to be dropping down to our low of 31 degrees, so you are going to want to grab that light jacket. Tomorrow going to be quite like today, mostly sunny skies with a high of 52, and we'll be dropping down to a low of 23, so if you don't have those heavy jackets out, you are going to want to start to get them out as well, because that chill is going to last until Friday. For more, you can follow us on Twitter at WCRDWX or go online for WCRD.net/weather.
It's 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening at WCRD. That means it's time for the Fantasy Express. I'm Steven Sobek, your host, joined alongside Robert Segovia. You could follow us on Twitter at BSU Fantasy. Also, I am at Steven_Sobek. And Robert, your Twitter, I invented a new word today. Twitter handle is...
Tweedledee. No, it's at Robert L. Segovia. And now we're going to get into the injuries and suspensions for Week 10. So Devontae Freeman of Atlanta, he had an additional shoulder injury to the one that he had going into Week 9, and he may be limited again in Week 10. So Tevin Coleman would be doing just fine as his replacement. Julio Jones, also on the Falcons, he suffered a lower leg injury versus Carolina. It's uncertain how much it will affect his play against Dallas, but if it's not too serious, he'll be ready to go, and you should definitely start him as usual. And Charles Clay for Buffalo, I was surprised to check my fantasy team, and I saw a projection for his stats this week. I didn't know what to make of that, but he might give it a go this week.
Potential false hope.
Yeah.
We will find out more as the week goes on.
Right.
And I think it will be interesting to see what his role could be with Kelvin Benjamin finally coming into the offense at receiver, and also LaShawn McCoy. So we'll monitor that situation with Clay. Josh Gordon made the list this week. He wants to come back to the NFL and prove that he can be the best receiver in the game. Obviously, he's had a troubled past dealing with drugs and alcohol. But hey, a new opportunity. It remains to be seen what he'll make of it. Robert, do you think he has a legitimate shot of finding a team and making a statement at any point over either this year or the next year?
Well, I don't know what team would be wanting someone who's been suspended so many times, except for the Browns. And, the Browns really need more star players, and Josh Gordon fits right in. So, Cleveland is the perfect spot for him. What do you think?
Yeah, less than 2 minutes into the show, and there's our first dig on Cleveland for the night. No, I think you're right. They have to have something going for them. I don't necessarily believe that Gordon's really the guy you want to focus on, especially when you're winless. I think you have to make sure everything else is going right before you really worry about a guy that hasn't played in the NFL in years. So they need to secure their quarterback starter first before they can worry about Gordon. Another wide receiver that has been playing but makes the injury list this week is Dez Bryant, who suffered an ankle and knee injury. He said he was sore, but he should be practicing this week, and hopefully he'll be a go again for Dallas. Robert, Kenny Galladay, he's also on the report and has not seen any action since week 3.
Yeah, he might be coming back to the lineup, which would be a really good opportunity as the Lions play the Browns this week. So maybe Galladay has a good week coming back after week 3. That's a really long time. We're in week 10 now, and another name on the list broke my heart when I saw it. It was breaking news on my phone. Deshaun Watson. It's with a heavy heart and an extra fantasy spot. that I say Watson tore his ACL in practice, suffering the injury in a non-contact play, and with surgery on Wednesday, he gears up for an 8 to 9 month recovery period, putting an end to a fantastic fantasy and NFL rookie season with 19 touchdowns through week 9. I salute you, Deshaun. Get well as soon as possible. What do you make of the Texans?
Well, the Texans are really going to struggle now that they have to turn to Tom Savage at quarterback. I was a little late to the party. I think I texted you 3 minutes after you received the first news of Watson tearing his ACL. So I'm sure that's exactly what you wanted to hear was me rubbing it in your face yet again. But no, Houston's going to have to figure out something. The good news is they play in a weaker division. And now they're injured on both sides of the ball. You know, J.J. Watt was down. Clowney's been dealing with injuries. Now it's Watson. So it'll remain to be seen what Houston can do with that team. Teddy Bridgewater is also a quarterback that, you know, he hasn't played. He almost... There was a worry quite like Zach Miller just experienced where he might have actually lost his leg. That's how severe his knee injury was when he suffered it over a year ago now. But he plans to be active this week. Probably not going to start. The job is Case Keenum's to lose. Yeah. But keep an eye on Bridgewater. Just see how Minnesota handles his practice workload and his role in general coming back from that devastating injury. Jimmy Graham for Seattle also had an ankle injury. Did not participate in practice early this week. Keep an eye on him because there's not much depth behind Graham at tight end for Seattle. It's Luke Wilson, I believe, is their backup, another Wilson. So you could see a Wilson to Wilson connection this week. Jimmy Graham potentially could miss that game. Mike Evans, not due to injury, but this brawl, and I'm sure we'll probably get into it in the middle of the show. He comes over after Jameis Winston shoves a Saints player and just levels a guy, knocks him clear off the field. He's out for one game. What a wild weekend in terms of just fighting in the NFL. What is going on here?
I don't know, but the Buccaneers really need to get it together. Jameis Winston, he's on the injury list too, and you just think the Buccaneers have so much talent, and to see Mike Evans go down in a suspension, that's really heartbreaking for them and their fans. But getting into Winston, he'll be out until at least week 13 with a shoulder injury. And finishing up the injury list is Jordan Reed from the Redskins. He remains day-to-day with a matchup against the Vikings coming up. And now we're going to take it into week 9 games. All times are Eastern as usual. We're here in Muncie, Indiana, Eastern time zone. And getting into the 1 o'clock games, there's 8 this week. We have the Green Bay Packers 4-4 at the Chicago Bears, who are 3-5. It's going to be I don't know. It's going to be a close game this week, Steven. Who do you have in this one?
Yeah, well, newsflash, it's week 10, actually. Week 10. Anyways, Green Bay, they're coming in, and this has the lowest total of all the games on Sunday at 38 total points. So not a lot of scoring expected at all in this game. Aaron Jones, Ty Montgomery split the carries, only 5 apiece last week. And it's going to be a really short week for Green Bay. They just played the Monday night game, and now they're turning around, heading to the Windy City to face the Bears, who, yes, they don't really have much going on offense, but their defense has stepped up, especially in the secondary. So the running game for Green Bay, Robert, I don't know exactly where you stand on this situation, but I don't, on a short week, I don't know if I roster any of those guys, either Montgomery or Jones, because I just don't think the matchup's there.
No, and I was looking at the matchup. I don't see anyone on the Packers that I really like this week. I highlighted Devontae Adams. He had 10 targets and 53 yards. He's the leading target for Brett Hundley, but it's Brett Hundley. So going over to the Bears, Jordan Howard, 23 carries and 102 yards. He was the big bright spot in that week 8 matchup. You reminded me it is week 10. I apologize to the listeners for that mistake. It was just on the fantasy sheet here as week 9, but we're all good here. And I feel like Howard is one of the better fantasy options this week against that Green Bay defense.
Whether it's week 9 or week 10, Chicago's run game is working. I'll say that. Jordan Howard has not received less than 18 carries since week 2. That's a huge amount of volume for him. Even Tariq Cohen now hasn't even really received any rushing attempts. He's been mainly a player in the passing game that is non-existent. So it's all Jordan Howard from here on out. He makes for a solid play against Green Bay. And really, is there anybody else that you would even consider throwing in your lineup on a short week for Chicago?
No, the only person that I had week to week was Zach Miller, but he's injured. And
just a little bit.
Yeah, just a little bit. But, just Jordan Howard. And Cohen was my guy, but he has fallen off as the season's gone along. And with Mitch Trubisky under center, I don't know if he gets that many options.
Yeah, the hype train is slowing to a stop on Cohen, but the hype train continues in both New Orleans and Buffalo. That's our next matchup. Drew Brees and even the run game. Who would have thought that New Orleans' strength this season would be the run game? The first person that you mentioned when you talk about the Saints is Drew Brees. He's been second fiddle to both Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara, but he's still producing at a high level. He's a top 10 fantasy quarterback. He spreads the ball around. He's got Michael Thomas and Ted Ginn, who a lot of people just considered to be a deep threat. He's almost taking over the Willie Snead role, I would say, because Snead didn't really see any action on offense, and he muffed a punt. So, Robert, Willie Snead, is he somebody that you even have on your bench at this point?
No, I don't. I haven't even seen his name come up in my free agents list. I haven't seen Willie Snead's name in a while, but Michael Thomas and Ted Ginn make up for that. And Drew Brees does still produce a lot of numbers with that rushing game, 263 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Saints are looking like one of the better fantasy teams in football, and I feel like that's one of the teams that you roster every week.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to, before we move on to Buffalo, I want to ask you this question. Michael Thomas seems to be decently touchdown dependent. He racks up a significant amount of yards every week, but can't find the end zone. That would really put him into the elite wide receiver tier. In PPR, he hasn't totaled fewer than 9.5 points since week 6, and actually week 6 was the only time he had gone below that number. In PPR, I'm thinking he makes for a tremendous play every week. Do you think it's time to look elsewhere if you own him in standard non-PPR scoring because he's not finding the end zone? Is he somebody that you might piece together in a trade just because he has a big name? He did great things last year. He's still receiving targets, just not finding the end zone. Is he trade bait?
Right. And, he is PPR strong, and getting into Michael Thomas value in trade bait, yeah, he's definitely one of those guys. He's ranked 4th in wide receivers. And when people see that come up in their trade, you're going to take that. And I think Michael Thomas is a big option if you're looking at the trade deadline coming up and you need to get a player or two. You could give up Michael Thomas and get some solid players in return.
Right, absolutely. And big names always help your case. If somebody who's really not following a certain player sees a Michael Thomas, or even I was able to swing a trade for LaShawn McCoy. I gave away DeMarco Murray, who actually I traded for earlier in the week. It was a series of trades, but those big names, even when they're not producing, do help. And in standard non-PPR scoring, Thomas he's okay. He's definitely a consistent guy for you, but I mean, really, he's in the same tier as Robert Woods, and now that he's gotten going in LA, guys like that. So I think Thomas definitely has some fantasy trade value. Another trade that happened in real life football, Kelvin Benjamin, we talked about last week, was dealt from Carolina to Buffalo. He should see his first action this week against the Saints, whose secondary has performed very well. But what are the expectations for Benjamin going into the second half of the season?
Well, I don't know. I didn't see him get involved last week. I'm sure that was the Bills' decision.
Well, right, he was actually, since it was a short week, he was officially ruled out, so he didn't see any snaps, and probably just because he wasn't familiar with the offense.
Yeah, and if you're looking towards this week for Kelvin Benjamin to maybe take off and have a big week, I don't think that's a good decision to start him. If you have Benjamin, maybe wait a week to see how he blends in this offense with Tyrod Taylor and LaShawn McCoy really being the main options in fantasy. If Tyrod Taylor can get the ball to Benjamin for some short passes and maybe one big one down the field, you might have a good game. But LaShawn McCoy is really the main option for the Bills.
Benjamin, to me, and he has had his share of injuries, but he's almost, remember, Buffalo had Sammy Watkins. Now, Watkins really was never able to show his full potential because he was always dealing with injuries, but Kelvin Benjamin, he's not as quick as Watkins, but he's a much larger frame, and I think he can stretch the field way more than Watkins can because he has the size. And so remember, it only takes one pass of 50 plus yards, and he's already at a solid floor, a good baseline for the week, and that's without the remainder of the game, just on one play. So Benjamin does give you that upside, but again, I asked the question, like Michael Thomas, we don't know how Benjamin's going to fit in Buffalo. We don't yet. We'd like to think that he will excel in his new role, but is Benjamin a guy based on name that you would shop now thinking, the rest of my league is probably going to consider him an elite option at receiver. He's going to a new team, new look, new offense. Or do you hang on to him because he will have a good impact on that Buffalo passing game?
Right. I think you keep him, and if you are going to use him in a trade, I think you hold off until this weekend to really see. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting for the Bills. Benjamin, he might get downfield. Tyrod Taylor scrambles out. They're going to go towards Taylor, finds a deep route for Benjamin. But when you're talking about fantasy trades, Kelvin Benjamin's name does come up a lot, and I don't know where, if he's really a good fit to move in fantasy this year, because he hasn't had a huge season with Cam Newton not doing as well.
Right, and I would suggest if you're going to pull the trigger, do it now. Don't wait, because if you don't feel confident in the second half of the season for Benjamin, you might as well get rid of him, because if you're right and he doesn't put up any numbers this week, and then his trade value goes down, because people see, he's only been in one game for Buffalo and he really didn't put up any points. That lowers the trade value significantly. So I think if you're going to get rid of him, if you're sold on the fact that he might not be as good as we're talking him up to be, then go ahead and try to find another team that would like to have him, at a receiver position or maybe even a flex. Cleveland might as well trade their whole team away at this point. They play Detroit, who's 4-4. Cleveland, obviously, still winless. I'm not even going to go there, am I? Is there a point to go and talk about Cleveland?
No, there's really nothing new to see here. It's the same story every week. All right, goodbye.
Yeah. Detroit is an interesting team, though, because obviously they have a decent matchup. They're at home, and they came off really an impressive victory at Lambeau Field. Granted, Aaron Rodgers was not there, but they ran the ball well. Marvin Jones had an awesome game. Matthew Stafford was getting him the ball early and often and in the red zone. Amir Abdullah is a guy I want to talk about because he's number one on the depth chart. He fumbled twice. They were in the lead. He lost one of the fumbles, and the second one was on the goal line. Is ball security something that Jim Caldwell takes into consideration, seeing as though they have people who could replace him, Theo Riddick, and on Washington as well? Is Abdullah in trouble?
Yeah, especially ball security and yards per carry. He had 21 carries. He went for 48 yards. That's 2 2 and a few yards per carry. That's not going to cut it. He did get a touchdown, but the Lions need something more. They can't rely on Stafford every week. I mean, that's what you want with Detroit, and it's good for Stafford owners, don't get me wrong, but Stafford had 350 plus yards in 2 weeks in a row, and Abdullah just isn't cutting it. He needs to move down a spot in the depth chart.
The rough part about having a Detroit running back is that Detroit runs the ball the least amount in the entire league. So you're already at a disadvantage with carries being allocated to the 3 running backs that are all capable. So with Abdullah, I'm starting to worry, if we'll see this week what Caldwell decides to do, because he went back to Abdullah on the goal line after he fumbled the series prior. So Caldwell gave him, tried to get his confidence back, I would think, and then he fumbled again. They recovered, but it's just, I feel like his chance was last week, and then he did that again and did not receive another carry. So coming up, hopefully, Cleveland's not bad against the run. As much as Cleveland's defense, I would say, is probably underrated considering that they don't have a win. They stack up well against the pass and the run. They're beatable. But really, their offense puts them in bad positions. They're always out on the field. That's why they struggle. So the matchup's not as great. Amir Abdullah, maybe hold off on him for this week, I would say. Cincinnati goes to Tennessee. We have the reversal of records here. Cincinnati at 3-5, Tennessee at 5-3. Tyler Kroft only had 2 catches last week, but for 79 yards with A.J. Green, hopefully playing a full game. We'll talk about that. Does Kroft have good value?
Yeah, I like Kroft, especially if Andy Dalton can get back on track. He hasn't really looked himself this season, and I don't know what that's about. And I don't know if Cincinnati needs a new look, a new direction, but if Dalton can find some offense with Kroft and Green, just a little more, getting them involved, I think the Bengals have a good chance of being the Titans, and you can have a good week in fantasy with Kroft.
Mike Evans was suspended for the game for coming in way after the play and demolishing one of the Saints players. A.J. Green, I don't know if he thought he was in the middle of the UFC octagon there against Jalen Ramsey, but it was ugly. I mean, that was shades of Andre Johnson and Cortland Finnegan, and also, if you remember, Odell Beckham and Josh Norman going at it. It was very similar. He gets thrown down on the ground by Ramsey, then turns around, puts him in a chokehold, and then starts throwing punches. Was that deserving of a suspension, even though Green has no history whatsoever?
Yeah, it's deserving of a suspension, especially if you're going to go around and suspend all these guys around the NFL for stuff like that. Then you need to suspend Green, and I don't know what he was doing. I don't know what he was thinking, but he's putting his team in jeopardy for this big game against the Titans, and I don't know why he did that.
And it's a conversation for another day. Of course, Roger Goodell and his history of inconsistent suspensions is one that we could probably have a whole show on. But Green will be active, so I would say, if anything, he sets up to have a monster game. I would hope he's going to have a chip on his shoulder coming out. This sets up well for him. Dalton probably will look to him quite a bit because he's really only been a red zone target for Cincinnati the last few weeks that he has been available to play. In Tennessee, their passing game, not really good. Corey Davis led them in routes run last week. Only had 28 yards on 2 catches. Is the Tennessee passing game non-existent now?
Yeah, Marcus Mariota hasn't been the guy this season, similar to Andy Dalton. And that's really what this matchup comes down to, which quarterback can have the better game. And if Mariota can get the passing involved, then Delaney Walker and Rashard Matthews are my guys in fantasy. Walker last week at 71 yards. He's actually averaging 6 receptions and 60 yards for a second week in a row, and Rashard Matthews at 70 yards and a touchdown. So I think those are the guys that you start regardless. But Mariota needs to get out of his slump.
Considering the matchup, does Corey Davis have over or under 50 total yards this week?
Under, mostly because of Walker and Matthews. That's
Fair
just
enough.
that's just my
And honestly, Eric Decker's been a no-show over the last few weeks. He hasn't really even been a part of that passing game.
I forgot he was even on the team.
Yeah. So that's good for Davis. That's one less guy he has to compete with. But it's just not a great situation there. And DeMarco Murray's dealing with that knee injury. He came out for a little bit during the game. Derrick Henry came in, got that goal line touchdown, but really didn't benefit much. So really not looking great for Tennessee. Cincinnati has a solid defense. So particularly low scoring, I would project in that game. Pittsburgh's probably going to put up a lot of points this Sunday in Lucas Oil Stadium. They take on the Colts. For me, Pittsburgh's a team. You just start your studs, sit back, turn on the game, and just watch them dominate.
Yeah, that three-headed monster, Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown, and now your guy, you said him before, Juju Smith-Schuster.
Juju, you got good Juju.
Yeah,
good
and
vibes.
He had 7 receptions, 193 yards, and a touchdown before that bye week. Man, I was really impressed with what I saw. Ben Roethlisberger has a lot to work with, and Le'Veon Bell takes that pressure off of him. I remember we were talking earlier in the season, was Big Ben was he worthy of a Hall of Fame spot, especially with how he was looking earlier in the season? He threw 5 interceptions in that Jaguars game, and he's really come back and put up big numbers.
He did. He had something to prove. And again, I think a lot of people, we all overreacted after that game against Jacksonville at home, similarly to how we did when Tom Brady went to Kansas City in that opening week game a couple years back and put up a dud. Is this the end of his career? And look what he's done. So I'm not saying Ben Roethlisberger's on track for a Super Bowl, but he'll put up some solid numbers on Sunday. Jacoby Brissett at quarterback for Indianapolis, he takes way too many hits, and I don't even necessarily think that it's a product of the offensive line not holding up. Usually he just hangs on to the ball too much. If he's facing pressure looks, stacked boxes, or where they're coming from blitzes either off the edge or up the middle with the linebackers, sometimes they'll even stunt the defensive lineman. He just keeps in the pocket and holds on. Now, I like a guy who sticks with the pass. I don't like people who will just, first read's not there and they bail out. That's not helpful. Russell Wilson does that, and look at how their offense is fairly inconsistent. But Brissett, he had that, strip sack, fumble, touchdown for Houston. They hung on, but if that doesn't happen, then the Colts, only gave up 7 points. That's great. So Brissett, he has to limit the mistakes, and I honestly, for the sake of completion percentage, I'd rather him just throw it out of bounds or try to get the ball downfield rather than taking all those sacks, because it looks terrible for the Colts linemen. They actually give up the second most quarterback hits in the league. You like T.Y. Hilton. He had a brilliant game in Houston. Had that funny play where he actually wasn't touched down and got up and ran in for a touchdown. Very heads up on his part. Jack Doyle, do you think he has fantasy value as well?
I think he does. I didn't put him on my list for fantasy this week, mostly because T.Y. Hilton accounted for almost half of Jacoby Brissett's passing yards and the 2 touchdowns. But Jack Doyle, he's always a tight end option in fantasy. I don't think he does it against the Steelers, because the Steelers do have a really good defense, and they're going to be limiting those middle passes down the field in the short game. So, you just look for T.Y. Hilton to have a really big yardage moment.
Right, and I would think so. And also, some of the bigger tight ends are on bye. Gronk's coming back, but Kelsey's on bye. So even if you're fortunate enough to own both Kelsey and Doyle, I really think you have to put Doyle in your lineup at tight end. He's too big of a name, and he's shown consistent targets and receptions all season long. He's gotten over his drop problem. He had that for a few weeks, fumbled a couple of times. That seems to have passed. So I'd fire up Doyle. I actually like him a little bit more than you do. Even in a tough matchup, it's at home. And if they're behind, then that means they're passing, right? So sets up nicely for Doyle. If I were to have asked you at the beginning of the season who would have the better record come week 10, the Jets or the Bucks, who would you have said?
I mean, Tampa Bay. Yeah.
Right. No brainer. No brainer. Not even a thought or a pause. They had all the places that they had key, guys at every position on defense. Gerald McCoy, great defensive lineman. You got Quan Alexander out there, and Vernon Hargraves is really disappointed at cornerback. And they also had a couple other guys too. And then the offense, all those skill position guys. Doug Martin coming back from the suspension. Winston was supposed to have a breakout year. This was the make or break year for him. I think he's broken it at this point, both his shoulder and the way he's performed. Mike Evans, and he got Deshaun Jackson. I mean, what else could you want if you're Tampa and you're 2-6? So what is there to say?
I mean, I don't know what's going on with the Buccaneers. I like starting them in fantasy, but it's beginning to look really bad for them. I was going to say to look a lot like Christmas, but it's not Christmas for Tampa Bay. They're not getting any presents this week against the Jets. The Jets, very surprising. Josh McCown, he ranks 8th in touchdowns and 2nd in completion percentage. I think he's a guy, we're going to get into this in the waiver wire, but he really needs to be picked up in fantasy. What do you make of Josh McCown?
I'm surprised he's available in so many leagues. He's shocked a lot of people, and we're still not on his bandwagon. I think it's about time to jump on. Also, Robbie Anderson's bandwagon has taken off. That's 3 straight games with the touchdown now. He did it again. Unfortunately, though, Austin Seferian-Jenkins hasn't seen really many yards at all. He hasn't gone over 30 yards in each of the last 2 weeks. So tough go of it. Although the matchup sets up nicely, Tampa really can't defend the pass at all. So hopefully Seferian-Jenkins will be able to get back on track for you in a week with 4 teams on bye. Do you think he does bounce back? I like to think that he will.
Yeah, I think he bounces back, but I have him on my bench this week, and for good reason, but he's not a guy you can ignore. You have to take a look at Seferian-Jenkins every weekend, and you predicted it very well a few weeks back, and you said he was going to be a breakout tight end, and he was just that. And, going over to Washington, we have the Minnesota Vikings at Washington Redskins, and you look at the Vikings. What do you make of the running back situation, McKinnon and Latavius Murray? McKinnon had a really good week, 50 yards and a touchdown rushing and 72 yards receiving. Do you think Latavius Murray has a good week this week, or is that the end of his run?
I tend to think that it's the end of his run, if I had to guess, because remember we said roster him when they went over to London and played Cleveland just because of the matchup. Jerick McKinnon's the guy. Since Dalvin Cook has been out, he hasn't received fewer than 14 carries in any of the 4 ball games that he's played in. So it's consistency, and really, when it comes down to the Latavius Murray territory of your roster, he's probably a candidate that you would consider starting at your flex over a couple of wide receivers. And I don't know if this is the week. I think you'd have to give the edge to, depending on who those wide receivers are, I think you'd have to give them the go or the nod this week, especially, since at your flex position you can start tight end, receiver, or running back. He's probably not a running back 2 at all. I mean, McKinnon's more of a running back 2 on a good team. So I think the McKinnon train keeps on moving along. Adam Thielen, another guy, receiving a ton of yards. He's getting touchdowns as well. Stephon Diggs, he should be healthy. He's had a week to rest up. He should be a solid wide receiver 2 with wide receiver 1 potential, because if they hook up on a deep ball, again, it only takes 1, and Washington's average at defending passes down the field this year. So there's a lot of interesting options on Minnesota, and I would not have thought that, considering Case Keenum's the quarterback. No offense to him, but he doesn't set up to be a good fantasy quarterback.
Not at all. And you're looking at the NFC North. I thought the Bears had a prime chance to take over the division, especially with Jordan Howard, Mitch Trubisky stepping in for that quarterback role, and Packers, Aaron Rodgers goes down. Minnesota, they've really been the team to beat in the North. the Lions maybe coming up.
They're hanging around.
Yeah, it's really a division to win for all the teams. And maybe the Packers go down a little bit. They probably have the least amount of chance in going into the playoffs. But I really like the Vikings for the season.
Yeah, I do too, and their defense leads them. I mean, there's no doubt about that. They have a very solid defense, but yeah, Minnesota stacks up really well on offense too. A lot of guys that are worth a roster this week, and then Washington. It's really Jordan Reed. He's dealing again with an injury. He seems like he's eternally questionable. But Vernon Davis stepped up nicely, 6 catches for 72 yards. Does he continue that production again?
Yeah, and especially with Jordan Reed questionable for the next game, I like Vernon Davis. Jordan Reed has really been on an injury tear in the time that he's been in the NFL. So I like Vernon Davis again, 6 receptions, 72 yards. He's going to continue that production. Kirk Cousins has a guy to throw to.
Yeah, and I know, speaking of guys to throw to, Cousins, they lost Deshaun Jackson. They lost an aging Pierre Garçon, replaced him with Terrell Pryor. Where is he?
I don't know. And I thought he would be that speedy target coming from the Browns, new location, a chance to prove himself.
I think he would be just ecstatic to get out of Cleveland.
Yeah, and he's just gone to a worse spot in Washington. And that's a place where tight ends thrive, but, you really need a wide receiver to step up, and he hasn't been it.
No, not at all. And guys that have stepped up for their teams at running back, Melvin Gordon and Leonard Fournette, they're going to face each other on Sunday, the last game in our 1 o'clock window. And Melvin Gordon, he's coming off the bye week, been able to heal some of his injuries. And really, the matchup's great. Jacksonville defends the pass at a very high efficiency. And really, can you roster anybody else on here we go again. San Diego. No, they're not San Diego. They're Los Angeles. I'm Los Angeles. Can you roster anybody other than Gordon?
Maybe Travis Benjamin, 64 yards and a touchdown last week, but I don't know anybody else on the Chargers except Gordon that would have that fantasy big production role. And if you go over to the Jaguars, Leonard Fournette was absent due to suspension. Bortles gave his best start of the year, 259 yards and a touchdown. Not too amazing, but it's really no reason to start him. Just pointing it out. And Leonard Fournette really is the guy to shine. Marquise Lee, do you think he can be a producer in the wide receiver?
I do, and we'll talk about him in the waiver wire segment. I do think that, because really that's really the only option that Jacksonville has outside of Fournette, throwing to their running backs. So Marquise Lee, suits up well. The Chargers defend the pass well. Both of these teams do a very good job of defending the pass. It's going to be a run-dominated sort of game. Blake Bortles or Phillip Rivers? Who do you think? Who do you have? If you had to stack them up head-to-head, who has the more points this Sunday?
Phillip Rivers. And, last week isn't an indication of Bortles having a good week this week, of course. But Phillip Rivers is always the guy when it comes to fantasy. He hasn't really done that this season, but Phillip Rivers over Blake Bortles every day.
He's turnover prone, and it scares me a little bit. Probably a little bit too much, but he throws his fair share of interceptions. I would give the slight nod to Bortles.
Interesting.
Yes. I know it sounds a little contradictory against the grain, but I'm liking Blake Bortles over Phillip Rivers if you're forced to make that decision. We'll be right back after a short break. We will run through our college selections, hit the rest of the 4 o'clock games and the primetime games for this week. You're listening to the Fantasy Express on WCRD 91.3, Always Better Radio.
Hey, Russell Wilson here, and I know how important exercise is.
It's essential. It's essential.
With Play 60, United Way and the NFL are helping kids stay active and play at least 60 minutes a day.
Healthy kids, healthy kids.
But what this place needs is you. To donate or volunteer, go to unitedway.org/play60, because great things happen when we live united.
Donate.
Are you guys going to do that every time?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
Hey, Dr. Phil here. You know, I help people solve difficult problems every day, but one problem has me stumped: childhood hunger. Nearly 16 million children in America struggle with it. Luckily, the Feeding America network of local food banks collects surplus food, giving hope to hungry children and their families. But they need your help. Join me in supporting Feeding America and your local food bank at feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
We're back on the Fantasy Express. It's time for the college pick'em. Robert, you're 11-9 this year. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm only 2 wins under you, but I feel pretty good. I've taken a few gambles and a few good picks that ended up turning into upsets. So I feel really good about it. How about you?
That's always the risk. Usually, some of them turn out well, and then the ones that you're so close, you don't end up on the right side of the score line, and it bites you. And we're kind of both close to 500. I'm a little bit better, 13-7. Robert's at 11-9. Last week we got Alabama correct. They beat LSU 24-10. Oklahoma State was a shootout. I had Oklahoma. I came out on top. They beat the Cowboys 62-52. Sorry, Robert, you're giving me the stare, but you know what that means. You had Oklahoma State. We both, unfortunately, and I said this was going to be a close physical game, and I was right, but I had the winner incorrect. Penn State lost to Michigan State on the road. Kind of a weird game with the long delay due to weather. And lastly, I said I used my head with this pick. Clemson went to North Carolina State and beat them 38-31. Robert, you had Clemson as well. So we had a pretty decent week. Moving ahead, though, we have another tremendously, really star-studded week. Huge teams, highly rated teams. The first, Iowa going to Camp Randall to face the 8th-ranked Wisconsin Badgers. Robert, who do you have?
I have the Badgers in this one. I was watching Iowa beat Ohio State in that blowout game. I struggled picking this game, but I think Wisconsin's defense can help them remain unbeaten.
This is going to be Penn State, Michigan State again this week in the Big Ten. Another physical matchup. 2 Iowa teams can show up, either the one that was playing with a chip on their shoulder against Ohio State and knocked them into another area code, quite frankly, or it's going to be an Iowa team that is so happy that they beat Ohio State that they're not focusing on this game. I tend to think that Kirk Ferentz will get into his guys and really show up for this game as well. And I've got Iowa in the upset, the road upset here. Georgia, number 1 team in the country, goes to Auburn. That's another really solid game, and I like Auburn actually in this game because I think Jared Stidham can stretch Georgia's secondary a little bit, keep them guessing and away from targeting just the run game. So I have the Tigers in this one.
Well, continuing the theme of cutting against the grain, Steven, you're doing that, but I'm sticking with Georgia. Georgia already clinched the SEC East, but they have really been playing well, and Auburn has a tough schedule to finish off the season. They're going to play Georgia and then Alabama. That's going to be really tough. But I do have Georgia in this game. They have similar numbers, but it comes down to a big play in the end, and I think the Bulldogs can go into Auburn and beat the Tigers.
I'd like to think Auburn controls their own destiny. So does TCU, and so does Oklahoma. Both one-loss teams facing each other. Oklahoma, again, coming off that hard-fought Bedlam game. I like the Sooners at home. Baker Mayfield's just proven time and time again he shows up for the big game, so I like the Sooners.
Yeah, I like the Sooners too. Baker Mayfield is too good for me to pick against Oklahoma. And picking Oklahoma State last week to beat the Sooners, I feel like it's my turn to pick the Sooners this week, and Baker Mayfield shows up for me. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe I jinxed him. Who knows?
Yeah, last but certainly not least, the primetime game. Notre Dame goes to Miami. That crowd will be electric and rocking. The U seems to be back, but we're really going to find out a lot about both of these teams this weekend. I'm siding with the Irish, though. I think they're dominant up front. Their offensive line will open up the run game. Miami is known to give up many chunk plays in the running game. Really, their secondary is their strength. So I like the Irish to get the win, although a narrow one on the road.
I don't know if I can pick against Notre Dame. They're my favorite team. I don't mean to be biased, but there's really something special about this season. Number 3 playing number 7. I think Notre Dame goes into Miami and wins a big game.
All right, you heard it here first. There are 3 4 o'clock Sunday games in the NFL. The first one, Houston at the Los Angeles Rams. No Deshaun Watson. We already talked about it. So really the question here is, with Watson being out for the season, who does it impact most? Lamar Miller, DeAndre Hopkins, or Will Fuller?
It brings up the value of Miller, and it drops the value of Hopkins and Fuller, but not too much. I saw them get decent production with Tom Savage. Hopkins more than Fuller. Hopkins is a more complete receiver. And I think Lamar Miller continues to be that running back threat for Houston.
You're still a big believer in this Houston team without Watson. And really, I mean, there's really no reason. If Tom Savage can at least be consistent, not turn the ball over, then I think they're set up for still some success down the road. But I really, as far as prospects, I think Fuller takes the biggest hit because Savage is just not accurate with downfield throws. Los Angeles, a team that's scoring at will their opponent. I mean, Todd Gurley has surpassed Kareem Hunt for the number 1 spot at fantasy running back with the most points scored this season. I'm thinking start your studs and then some. Cooper Kupp even getting a roster spot, and obviously Robert Woods after that 2-touchdown performance on Sunday. Things are looking awesome. And I never thought I'd say that, but things are looking awesome, and it's been a quick turnaround for the Rams.
You know, my fantasy team is I love Kareem Hunt. I don't know if I'm going to change that to I love Todd Gurley just yet. But the Rams are definitely becoming one of my favorite teams to watch, similar to the Chiefs, and Jared Goff has been a big part of that. 311 yards, 4 touchdowns. It only took him 12 completions to do that. And he's 8th in touchdowns, 10th in yards. He's really been a big story along with Gurley. And which wide receiver do you think can help Goff have another good week?
Watkins finally showed up. He had that long touchdown catch, but I think Robert Woods, again, the more consistent they are, the more I like them. And so it's Woods for me if I had to pick. Another matchup this week between 2 teams fighting in their divisions for playoff spots. Dallas at 5-3 goes to Atlanta. And the story for Dallas is health at wide receiver. Des Bryant, a little bit shaken up. Also Terrence Williams, after having a monster day, headed over to the sidelines, limped off the field with what seemed to be an ankle injury. So what are we looking at?
Well, you got Dak Prescott, 249 yards, 2 touchdowns passing, 1 touchdown rushing. He's been a real force in the Cowboys offense, top 6 in passing touchdowns and rushing touchdowns. When you're looking at Ezekiel Elliott, he's been just as elusive on the field as he is in the legal processes of the United States judicial system. That's Elliott, 93 yards and a touchdown. I had a segment last week talking all about the possible suspension of Elliott, actual suspension, but he got out of it, and it really kind of bugs me. And I think Elliott, if he can evade the law once more, has another good week.
Wow, that well said, well stated. I'll give you that one. It really, just for me, if Dez is healthy, you play him. Terrence Williams, before last week, had only exceeded 50 yards once, and it was week 1. So I think he had one of those games and is not going to see that production again in Atlanta. In Atlanta, Julio Jones, potentially the drop of the year, wide open in the end zone, falls down, the ball hits the field and incomplete. I know somebody in my league, it cost them the win. Huge play, or I should say lack thereof. Matt Ryan, is he consistent enough to deserve a roster spot?
No, 313 yards and 2 touchdowns isn't going to cut it when it comes to consistency. He needs to do that again for me to believe in Matty Ice again. So I think you still look at Julio Jones because Ryan can get the ball to him, but he really needs to get more of his passing game involved. And I don't know if Devontae Freeman's a big part of that. He's battling an injury, but Tevin Coleman has really come up big for Atlanta.
Right, and the entire Atlanta offense is in limbo, I would say, would be the best analogy. Mohamed Sanu, a touchdown, but only 23 yards. I think he could deserve a flex start in deeper leagues this week. And then the last game to round out the 4 o'clock time slot, really nothing to be said here. It's the Giants and the 49ers. Again, another winless team hosting a 1-7 Eli Manning-led Giants squad, if you can even say that. He really doesn't have much control of that offense and has two targets that he trusts, Evan Ingram and Sterling Shepard. I think it's funny, on a team that's this bad, they actually, since there's no options for Manning to throw to, present very strong, fantasy starts.
Right. You don't have a lot of players to think about if you're the Giants, and that's really good when it comes to fantasy. You've got guys like Evan Ingram, Orleans Darkwa, I want to highlight in the waiver wire. I'm not going to talk about him just yet. He had 71 yards, but he's been a big part of this Giants offense, and Eli Manning has really shined with Evan Ingram in that position at tight end.
Yeah, and San Francisco, all I have to say is dumpster fire. Bringing back the term.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, San Francisco's definitely a dumpster fire. Jimmy Garoppolo goes from one backup role to another. Tom Brady to CJ Beathard. And I don't know if
who's better between those two. Robert?
I'd say CJ by a hair. But Garoppolo, until he starts, I don't think anybody on the 49ers deserves a look.
Right, and Garoppolo's old team, the Patriots, will be in action on Sunday night, 8:30 on NBC. They travel to Mile High Stadium, Denver. Brock Osweiler looking to start and upset the Patriots again. He's done it once. Can he do it again?
Yeah, I think that...
Oh, that sounded really confident.
Yeah, I think that Denver really lost big against the Eagles, and the Patriots really need to take advantage of that. And Tom Brady, he's going to capitalize on it. Chris Hogan, I don't know if he's going to give it a go versus the Broncos. He's injured, but Rob Gronkowski might have a big week. Do you think any of those running backs are going to have a solid week against Denver? Big rushing defense.
They're a big rushing defense. However, from the running back position, James White catches the ball a lot more than really any other running back. So I think since he's two-dimensional, I'd go with White if I had to start one. But again, Gronkowski's matchup is tremendous. Denver has a good pass defense, but not against tight ends. So Gronkowski's going to be an elite starter. And really, we have the same questions at running back for Denver. Is it Devontae Booker, C.J. Anderson, or Jamal Charles? If you had to start one.
I'd like to say Jamal Charles, but C.J. Anderson poses a bigger threat to New England. I mean, New England's defense is just so bad that really anybody can get fired up in this game. I have Demaryius Thomas listed as the only real consistent threat in fantasy, but I don't think anybody else. Maybe Emmanuel Sanders.
Anderson came off the field for a little bit there against Philadelphia, so I'm actually going to go with a dark horse pick. I like Devontae Booker. He's made the most of his touches. I think that's really key. And remember, New England is ailing on the defensive side of the ball, so there's yards and fantasy points to be had there. On Monday night, Miami, Carolina. Devontae Parker is all the rage for the Dolphins, but really I think, and this is probably contrary to a lot of other people's opinions about him, Parker suffers from the fact that Jay Cutler throws every single pass off of his back foot. So he's really not geared to throw the ball downfield on every play. He had a lot of checkdowns against Oakland. They were effective. He actually had over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns in that game. But Cutler and Parker, they have chemistry, but Cutler just doesn't put himself in a position to utilize that chemistry, I don't think.
Cutler's so inaccurate, and I was seeing videos on Twitter saying, did you see that throw by Jay Cutler where Devontae Parker had that one-handed catch? Did you see how accurate Cutler was? And I thought to myself, you're talking about Jay Cutler. That was an okay pass, and it was an amazing catch. That's what you have to highlight, the catch. It's not his pass that put it there. He did, but it was so inaccurate that he had to make a one-handed catch.
Parker has some great hands for sure. And then Carolina, really, it's Cam Newton, it's Devin Funchess, and it's Christian McCaffrey. I don't like anybody else. Those three guys put up their good amount of yards and good fantasy numbers. Without Benjamin, those are the three guys that you're looking at. Waiver wire for this week: Kansas City, Oakland, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, all on bye. All the studs in Kansas City are off: Hunt, Alex Smith, Tyreek Hill, and Travis Kelce. The guys in Oakland. Philadelphia is another team that has a lot of depth, a lot of fantasy depth. So really only 4 teams on bye, but a lot of big names gone and not available to you this week. So at quarterback, Robert, Josh McCown and Jared Goff, they're owned in about half of leagues, Goff a little bit more so, but they're actually bigger names that you could still probably find on your waiver wire.
Yeah, McCown and Goff have very similar numbers, both around 2,000 yards and 13 touchdowns. McCown's been really good this season. It's really surprising to see how many teams he's been left off of. You touched on that earlier. And Jared Goff, on the other side, he's been really good this season with Todd Gurley's explosiveness out of the backfield. Goff has been able to exploit that the pass defense in whatever team he faces. And, I don't know which player I'd take. I'd probably take Jared Goff over McCown because he looks like he's having more of a Deshaun Watson-like run, but McCown has been more consistent.
Right, and my guys are Fitzpatrick, who's only 11% owned for Tampa, filling in for Winston, and yes, C.J. Beathard, just because the New York Giants defense looked totally uninspired against Los Angeles last week. He's only 2.4% owned. Nice. Moving over to the running back position, I already talked about it when we were talking about the Patriots and Broncos game. Devontae Booker, for me, only 6.8% owned in ESPN leagues. New England's the 4th worst at defending that position. And also, I think you can stash Peyton Barber, 0.3% owned. He's the backup in Tampa, but got 11 carries for 34 yards in garbage time. And if Martin, for whatever reason, loses the handle on that starting job, then Peyton Barber's the guy, because Jacquizz Rodgers is not in the picture anymore. And you already talked about Orleans Darkwa. He's been unstoppable for the last few weeks now, 52% owned. He's gone 3 straight weeks with 10 plus points. So since week 4, he's been really the picture of consistency at running back. Wide receiver, we got Juju. We love Juju. We've liked him, or at least I've liked him for a while now, and he's proven his worth in that Pittsburgh passing offense. I also like Marquise Lee. We promised we'd talk about him. He's 40% owned, and yet remains the number 1 option in Jacksonville's passing attack. Would you say, oh man, he's the number 1 option in Jacksonville's passing attack? They don't have much of one, but it's worth something. So Marquise Lee for me, and you also like Tyler Lockett.
Yeah, Tyler Lockett, if he's healthy and ready to go, he can provide decent numbers off of the wire, especially with Russell Wilson heating up. You can expect all of the wideouts to get their fair share of points. Lockett is at 44% owned. And going into tight ends, you have to keep an eye on the injury report for Charles Clay. We talked about it earlier, but he's only 31% owned. He was dropped by a lot of people, not put on the injury reserve in their fantasy league. Maybe a mistake. So go ahead and take advantage of that. Tyler Kroft, he's been a consistent performer for the Bengals, 10 points per contest since week 4, 48% owned. And Vernon Davis, we already talked about him, 59% owned. I see Garrett Selleck.
Yes. Not even the best Selleck in the league. No. But he is my dart throw this week at tight end. He's facing the worst defense guarding the tight end position, the Giants, and he's filling in for the injured George Kittle. 0.2% owned. That might be the lowest ownership that I've ever suggested picking up. But Garrett Selleck, for me, could find the end zone this week. Don't count me on that, but I would not be surprised if I saw his name in the stat sheet. Quickly, we'll move to our eliminator before we wrap up with the Thursday night game. I'm 5-0, 9-0 overall. I had the Eagles last week to beat the Broncos. They did 51-23. I'm going to cheat. I'm picking Detroit, beating Cleveland, and I really don't need an explanation. So, Robert, who do you have?
Yeah, I'm 4-1. Last week I got the win. Jaguars beat the Bengals 23-7. I'll take the Los Angeles Rams over the Houston Texans. And listen, Jared Goff is starting a run similar to Watson. I talked about that. I don't expect him to stop against Watson's team, and Watson isn't there. Tom Savage is taking over, and he's going to be the guy to look for in Houston, but I think the Rams are just too powerful. and they're gonna take that win.
Solid pick. And I jumped the gun at the top of the show. We let off with Green Bay and Chicago. And I got so excited. I thought, man, the Packers really have a short week. They play the first game on Sunday, the Thursday night game. The real Thursday night game is Seattle at Arizona, divisional matchup. Really, I think this projects to be a really low-scoring game. Seattle struggled on offense. The play here, based on volume for Arizona, is Adrian Peterson. So I like him. Aside from that, obviously Seattle has their good receivers, Doug Baldwin and Paul Richardson. However, I'm not finding as much value there in this matchup, coming off a quick turnaround for both teams.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With the Cardinals, Adrian Peterson, he ran the ball 37 times, able to get 159 yards. That was a couple weeks after the 132 touchdown performance that he had with his first game in Arizona. So I like Adrian Peterson, Larry Fitzgerald. For the Seahawks, just like you said, the receivers. And I think if Wilson can stay hot, the Seahawks have a big game against the Cardinals. You're right, though, that NFC West matchup poses a threat with a field goal game.
Yeah,
and it might be a 12-9, 15-12. I don't know. It might be, but if they can refrain from that, I think the Seahawks pull through.
Yes, it does definitely set up to be one of those kinds of Thursday night games. Well, that's it. We're through all the games for this week. Stay tuned. Inside the Trenches will follow us with Noah Adamek and Lenny Ventimiglia. And for Steven Sobek and Robert Segovia across the desk, this has been the Fantasy Express. We will be back next week with another rundown of all the games here in WCRD Studios. You've been listening to the Fantasy Express, and stay tuned to Inside the Trenches.